Morning, family. Good morning. So one of the great things, he's going to cut me out of it anyway.
No, he won't. I won't let him.
One of the great things about being here is that we are a family and we get to watch people grow and change in their positions. I am really, really pleased to say that a young man who started here about 15 years ago.
He's old now.
I've watched him get married, I've watched him have children, and I've watched him come up in our ranks to a point where I am just so proud and excited to now have Mr. Janeer Austria as our Director of Operations, which means he is now Susan Sirota. So he's just going to say hi to you.
Thank you for being here and for everything you guys do. Thank you again, Rebecca, for the really, really kind introduction. My name is Janeer Austria.
Do I get a raise?
We'll talk about it. Yeah, so I guess you guys just want to know who I am. I have been with the museum for over almost 15 years now, and wear many hats like most of us do who actually work here. I am not the IT guy, but I'm a good stand-in for one, but I think most people just assume that I am an IT guy because I'm usually trying to get into like a technical project. But for the most part, I came here at the museum. It was supposed to be a bridge job for me as I prepared for the GRE and went to graduate school to become a physical therapist. It was supposed to literally be a 3-month gig. I was to help get the director of marketing and public events at the time through Festival of Sail. I know many of you guys know what Festival of Sail is and how big of a job that was to produce and run, and my goal at the time was just to get her through that, get all the vendors in and make sure everything would run smoothly. One thing happened in my life that I wasn't really expecting, and I drank the Kool-Aid, and 3 months turned into 14 years. I'm really grateful for that person because she actually had the foresight to see potential in me. Did not want me to be in a public assistant and or marketing assistant role, and created a marketing manager role for me, which kept me here for a very long time. From then, the role kind of grew where I took on the front line. The museum was like, hey, he's doing really good at taking this on, let's add another aspect to that job on there. So I took on security, and then I did that for many, many, many years until Kelly Lewis, our director of development, retired. And they asked me, hey, did you have any plans or aspirations of wanting to become operations? Because if you did, you would need to take on development. So they kind of dangled that carrot and forced me to take on another role so I can actually learn the museum and the museum's cash flows more holistically. And that's why I did development for a year last year, and I am now here, the director of operations. It's hard to kind of switch, but yeah, very happy to be here. My door is always open, and if you guys have any questions for me, let me know. Just a really quick aside, I am a born and raised San Diegan. My dad served 22 years in the U.S. Navy. I was basically born and raised on any kind of naval property here. I consider 32nd Street Naval Base my second home. Went to church there, had my first job there, bowled in a bowling league over on the dry side for, I want to say, 6 years. So 32nd Street is basically my home. I was born at Balboa. So, and I'm a San Diego State alumni, so I can truly say I'm a San Diegan at heart. Any questions?
Congratulations.
Thank you again for everything, and my door is always open, so if you want to stop in, have a good conversation, and just chat, let me know.
Thank you, Janeer. We're happy to have you. One of the secrets of life is always being willing to say yes.
Elementary, the foresail and the main topsail, and proceeded to walk down, made about 8 knots with the thing, way down the thing. Great time. So, as foreman captain, one of my jobs is bow watch. And what I'm doing with bow watch is I'm looking at the horizon, making sure there's no offending boat's gonna come and or give hand signals to the captain to make sure that they're aware. And so I'm looking straight ahead and I hear this clink, 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 boom. And everyone says, what was that? And I said, I don't know, I didn't see it, I heard it. And actually our first mate, Rick Wilson, said a chunk of the, up on the foremast area there, fell in the water. And what was it? Well, we don't know. No, we can't. Not a good sign. So, as we're sailing away, and it's time to go back, and our normal routine is to then douse the sails and collapse them. And the very first one we would do would be the foresail. Now, we got a little nervous about all that, so what we did is basically clue up while standing. And basically what this is something we use like when we do an emergency, and that is we'll haul up the sail as rapidly as possible. And we've actually gotten this thing down to probably less than a minute to do it. And what it is we have two people on one clue, two people on the other clue, and we just clue up on that. Basically it's called rise, tacks, and sheets. And cast off the tacks, cast off the sheets, and then just haul on those clues, and it just brings both clues up quite rapidly. So that worked out really, really well. The next step of this is to haul on the marnets, which are the lines that on the outside of the sail that bring it up. There's one on the fore part, one on the aft. And on the port side, when we did that, the marnet did not go up, the block came down. And actually we had a large chunk of wood that had 3 blocks on it, one being the outer bar turning block, one and the 2 for the barnets. That whole thing fell down, and it was a pretty significant amount of wood. And we were very, very fortunate that actually it just got fouled in the rigging, specifically on the marnet line, and so it just dangled there. And at that point, then we were able to go up. Aaron actually went up and with a couple handlings lashed it down so it wouldn't be swinging around. And then we made sure that we got everybody off of the foredeck because it was, we didn't know what else was going to happen. Right? So, to make the long story, try and make it shorter, we were able to get back uneventually. Actually did our normal one gun salute to the Star of India, and came back safely back to the dock. And at the dock, then we unrolled the lines and down. And so at this point, then everything we did was photo documented. So what we're going to do now is David Clark. We actually took a couple pictures, and since he was more involved with it than I was from the rigging standpoint, I'm going to give a little bit of explanation of that. But as we ended this whole thing, I went back and talked to the captain, and as I did that, then David Clark, in his normal wisdom, said, "Hey Bob, you broke the boat." Without realizing he was a little more wise ass than he normally is. I took it away with that. So, David? Oh, there you are.
Okay, so very fast continuing education opportunity. On the foremast, this circular structure some people call a crow's nest. It's not a crow's nest. That's a lookout post on a whaling ship. We don't have any crow's nests in this museum. Some people want to call that a basket. It's not a basket. Things have names. That's the foretop. The similar structure on the mainmast is the main top. Its foundation is 2 timbers, one each side of the mast that run fore and aft. Those are called trestle trees. On top of those are 2 other stout timbers that run sideways, thwartships. Those are called cross trees. What you see here is the cross tree on the port side, on the after side of the foremast. You see this intact, the end of this intact cross tree right here. Yeah, sure. So here's the intact end of the after cross tree on the port side of the ship. And you see here the port side of the cross tree on the forward side of the mast. No, you don't. It's not there. It's down hanging in the rigging. You do see a bolt where it had been bolted to the underside of this ring, the lower three rings in the foretop. Can we roll up just a little bit? We've also got these right angle brackets, or approximately right angle brackets, called knees. And there are knees on top of each of these timbers that run underneath the top. And in this case, the knee that should be right above the cross tree there is also missing. This is what broke. And now if we could go to the next slide, please. This is, for scale, this tape has been pulled out to 30 inches. So this is a big chunk of wood that's actually 3 separate pieces of wood. And what you see here is a lot of rot. Now, this has been looked at repeatedly and has been seen quite recently and showed no obvious external signs of damage. But there had been holes drilled in this wood back when it was being built, and it was not properly draining, so water had an opportunity to pool in there and rot the wood from the inside, which is how it escaped detection. There are other problems with some of the wood up there. I just, on my way in this morning, ran into Alex Cassidy, the first mate of the ship, who tells me that as of 9:59, the plan is they're going to cancel the San Salvador sailing events for March. They are jury rigging turning blocks as needed, and plan as of right now to still do the sailing events in April. We have a San Salvador Offshore Sailing Adventures. We have a Cinco de Mayo event coming right up before, immediately before Cinco de Mayo. The boat's scheduled to go to the San Diego Yacht Club for opening day. There's a boarded event, the pirate thing that Alan Wick does. Those are all, it looks like those are all still on. Some changed without notice, but this is being handled very expeditiously. But I know people are very curious about why the boat's not sailing, and I thought you all should hear what's going on here, and it is being addressed very aggressively. Questions? Okay, thank you.
Okay, before we get on to our Medea talk with Margaret, Saturday tours, by the way, everybody working out on the Saturday and Sunday tours for the trainees?
That was a big crowd Saturday.
Big crowd, yeah, it was a nice tour. Thank you, Andy. Any questions on the tours? You need to get 3 done, right?
Are we doing every Saturday and Sunday tours?
I'm trying to do that because we're creeping up to the final,
Right.
and we want to have them all done. Everyone needs 3 tours signed off on their sheet. You need to bring the sheet with you when you go on a tour, a shadow tour, so that they can get signed off. And then you have to do a tour of your own. So the weeks are creeping up on us. Don't wait till the last minute. Okay, this weekend, Bob Harrison, I'm sorry. You want to say anything?
Yeah.
You're leading the tour on Saturday.
Yes, for anybody who has not had a tour with me before.
Yes. If you've done a tour with Bob, you can't do 2 with the same person. He's going to start here on the Berkeley McKinney deck at
10:45.
10:45. Okay. Sunday, Susan Johnson, where are you? Back here. Susan is going to lead a tour on Sunday. At what time?
10:30 here.
10:30? Okay.
Is that a good time?
What time is the tour starting?
If everybody tries to be here 10:30, we'll start at 10:45 on the dot, so that gives you 15 minutes leeway. I'll kind of hang out up here until then. If you're later than that, you're not gonna find us.
On Sunday.
If it doesn't matter for anybody, so I'm taking the sales crew test, and I'd like to go on your thing, and I'm not sure how long that's gonna take. And that's, so later would work
Well, just answer everything A, and then you come on up. Well, maybe not.
All of the above.
What time does sales, at first I was gonna do noon, what time does sales training finish?
So it's for the test, I've never done it before.
What time does your test start?
If you're doing noon, it'll probably be okay.
So it starts at, I guess at 8:30.
Oh, the test will be here
Yes.
So
on
why don't I,
Sunday.
so why don't I do 12, afternoon's fine for me, let's do the afternoon. So, 12:30?
12 should be fine. You should be through the testing by then,
Or what time?
by 12.
Okay,
So,
12:30, I'll
Quarter?
tour up here.
okay, 12:15, be here, 12:30 you'll start the
Bring
tour.
your lunch. No.
It's only 45 minutes.
Two-hour tour.
So that's
Okay.
12:30.
All right, any final questions on any of that? Either I or Margaret, and, but you have to do your own tour. You have to lead a tour as well. When you get all three of your, shadow tours done, you notify myself or Margaret. And, we schedule you with one of the docent council people, which is myself, Bob Harrison, Margaret, David Berg.
I have a list which I will send to people.
Okay, Margaret will send you the list of people you can do the final walkabout with.
Yes, and for anyone who is confused, you lead the tour on your final walkthrough. I have had people who thought they just had to follow another tour.
It's to demonstrate you actually have absorbed reasonably accurate information on each of the ships, all of the ships, that we have here at the museum.
Okay.
All right, so, okay, one more question?
Yes, what time Sunday?
12:30.
12:30.
Be here at 12:15.
12:15, yeah, be here at 12:15.
So, question. So on leading our own tour, it sounds as though I lead the tour and you as the docent, kind of, you're the guest and I'm showing you.
Correct.
That's it.
You may get feedback as you go along to help you smooth out what you're doing or correct a few things, but it's not a highly critical thing. It's just to show that you're prepared to take a guest around the museum. Okay, let's move on to our talk on the Medea.
Can I make a comment real quick on that?
Yeah.
What I did before I had my final tour where I gave the tour is I had a couple friends and I took them and I did the tour with them first. And then I did it with the final,
Sure.
with,
more members. Warm up.
Thanks, Jim.
We have another question.
Yes, what time Saturday?
12:30.
Saturday.
10:45.
I think we said 12:15. That's what I have written.
The age of the steam yacht was 1830 to 1930 in round numbers. The first steam-powered vessel was launched in France in 1783, and the first steam-driven pleasure craft, the 120-foot Maritime, was built in 1830 in Britain. This was after the Royal Yacht Club had formally banned steam yachts. Thomas Ashton Smith left the club when he commissioned the Maritime. The first American steam yacht was the North Star, commissioned by Cornelius Vanderbilt in 1853. Only the very rich could afford large yachts like Medea, but smaller steam launches, Medea is 134 feet overall, but smaller steam launches were relatively common, with a peak of popularity between 1880 and 1914. When Medea was built in 1904, she was one of thousands of steam-powered pleasure craft. After the Great War, many Europeans were much reduced in circumstance and the appetite for expensive luxury diminished, as it did again on both sides of the Atlantic after the stock market crash in 1929. A handful of steam yachts were launched in 1930, a few were built after World War II, but by then diesel engines had almost completely displaced steam. A steam engine takes up more room than a diesel engine of comparable power. It takes time to come up to pressure compared with the near instantaneous power of diesel. And a steam engine requires constant monitoring and thus requires a larger crew. So today, there are only 4 left. Where is that button? There. No, that was back. Let's do forward. How about that? Cangarda. Medea is one of 2 steam yachts in the United States, and the other is the 130-foot Cangarda, built in 1901 in Wilmington, Delaware, now home ported at Mystic, Connecticut. There's a documentary about the restoration available online at ultimaterestorations.com/Cangarda. Cangarda seems to have changed hands in 2016, but I don't know any more than that. Ina, the 3rd Edwardian steam yacht, still running, is the 88-foot steam yacht built in Berries Bay, Sydney, Australia. Launched on the 8th of December 1900, she's, I understand, at the Australian National Maritime Museum in Sydney. Ina is featured in Series 3 of Miss Fisher's Murder Mysteries, if you'd like to have a good look at her. So, okay. Let's see. Delphine, another survivor. The 258 steam yacht Delphine, built at Great Lakes Engineering Works, River Rouge, Michigan. She was launched on 2nd of April 1921. Beginning in 1997, she was lovingly restored to the original 1921 condition, including the originals, at a cost of $60 million, and is now home ported in Monaco. So, there they are, the 4 of them. There's only 4, 3 are Edwardian. The 2004 Mansell Hall lists one steam yacht, the 300-foot Narlin, and noted that it was awaiting restoration. Unfortunately, during the restoration, they replaced the steam engines with diesel. So that's that. Another survivor of a sort is the 195-foot Gunilda, which sank in Lake Superior in 1911 and can be seen by divers 265 feet down. There are several movies on YouTube of Gunilda, so people have fun with that. So, this is my favourite photograph of William McAllister Hall doing the famous sword dance with rolled umbrellas. William McAllister Hall, he's on the deck of Medea, the aft deck. William McAllister Hall was born in Edinburgh on December 11th, 1872, and his name at that time was just William Hall. And Torresdale Castle, William's father was Peter Hall, a distant relative of the McAllister family that built Torresdale Castle in 1815 on the Kintyre Peninsula of Scotland. Peter Hall rented the castle in 1872 from its then owners and moved in with his new son William, and Peter subsequently bought Torresdale Castle. And sometime between 1872 and 1904, William decided to adopt the surname McAllister Hall, which is double-barreled but not hyphenated. In May of 1904, William McAllister Hall was young, single and rich, and decided to buy a steam yacht. Oh, the second picture on this page, by the way, was taken when a party from the Maritime Museum of San Diego went to Torresdale Castle in 2005. So that's who you can see. I am not there, I am sorry to say. I suspect that the name change to McAllister Hall and the yacht purchase might be related, perhaps by an inheritance from a McAllister relative, but I cannot prove that, which is another reason I would have liked to have gone to Torresdale Castle. So, here is the launch. 1904, McAllister Hall approached Alexander Stephen and Son to commission a yacht, and he asked if it could be ready in time for the glorious 12th, the 12th of August, when the grouse shooting season opens. On June the 1st, 12th of August, June the 1st, Alexander Stephen and Son wrote that they could have the yacht ready by the end of August, and Medea was built in just 51 working days. She was launched on the 29th of August 1904. Medea has a steel hull with decks and external housing of teak, and she originally cost £6,750, or about $34,000 at the exchange rate in 1904. She has a Scotch boiler that was originally coal-fired, a 254 horsepower compound engine, that is 2 steam cylinders as opposed to the triple expansion on the Berkeley, and her design cruising speed was 11.5 knots. Someone asked me earlier today why she was named Medea. The legendary Medea is chiefly remembered for having murdered her own children, so perhaps McAllister Hall was thinking of her as the enchantress who helped Jason find the golden fleece. So, this is Medea's prow, and it shows the trail board, and the only interesting thing about this picture is that it was taken during COVID, and she's got a COVID mask hanging around her neck. But this is the expansion of the trail board. The Medea of Greek mythology, granddaughter of Helios, the god of the sun, who gave her a golden chariot drawn by dragons. So the trail boards show Medea in her chariot. There she is. And the figurehead, yes, right, she has the surface. Here we are. Medea was built at the Linthouse boatyard of Alexander Stephen and Son on the River Clyde just west of Glasgow. McAllister Hall's home was on the Kintyre Peninsula, and he used Medea mainly on the west coast of Scotland. And he visited the islands of Mull, Jura, Islay and the Hebrides. William McAllister Hall was an officer in the British Army Reserves in the Argyll and Sutherland Regiment, and he had to attend a training camp every year, which was sometimes held at Ayr, just beyond the Isle of Arran and across the Firth of Clyde from Torresdale, so he went to camp by luxury yacht. Jura is the island northeast of Islay and south of Mull. The Hebrides are the islands northwest of Scotland, and Stornoway is in the Outer Hebrides. So, here's the Kintyre Peninsula. Craig Arnold's book about Medea says that the home port was at Campbelltown. However, Torresdale Castle was about a 15-minute walk to the harbour of Carradale, where Medea would moor in the summer months. McAllister Hall used Medea not just for hunting and fishing trips, but for ordinary transport, the same way you might use a car to go to town or to the railway station for onward travel to Edinburgh or London. On the way back, he'd meet Medea at Gourock for the last part of the journey home to Torresdale. There are contemporary descriptions of journeys by motor car, but the roads were rough and the cars were primitive, and a surprising number of the car journeys describe resulting breakdowns. So, much more practical to take the boat. So, this is Inverary Castle. The McAllisters belong to the Campbell clan, of which the Duke of Argyll is the chief, hence the Argyll and Sutherland Regiment. Inverary Castle, built in 1743, replacing a 15th century castle. It's been the seat of the Dukes of Argyll since then. Inver means estuary, and Inverary thus means estuary on the River Aire. So you can picture Medea tied up somewhere along this bank, if you like, perhaps at the end of the path across the park, which you can see. Captain Tetley and 2 women. In 1906, William was as yet unmarried, and he took Medea on a long trip down the west coast of Great Britain with an army friend named Tetley. This picture, yes, the picture is from the museum's collection, and it's labelled Captain Tetley and Two Women, which does rather leave the scene open to speculation. They had a crew of 9, including a cook and a steward, as well as an engineer and a fireman. Captain Tetley wrote an account of their vacation, in which he was evidently emulating Jerome K. Jerome's comic novel of 1889, Three Men in a Boat. The account appears in full in Craig Arnold's book, and it describes 2 young men travelling around Great Britain, fishing, flirting with barmaids, and generally having a good time. The picture of McAllister Hall dancing the sword dance on the after deck of Medea ought to represent this time, but it's actually dated 1911 after he was married. On the 8th of October 1907, William married Amy Gilmore. Amy kept a diary on board, and during the yachting season from April to September in each of the years 1908, 1909 and 1910. They evidently used Medea a lot, picking up friends and entertaining them, travelling about the coast, shopping, sometimes dining ashore. From the diaries, we know that she called William Donald for some unknown reason, and they named their first child Donald. They used Medea to visit the Highland Games in Oban, and at one time they used Medea as accommodation while Torresdale was being painted and a new wing was built. After 8 summer seasons, Medea was sold on 17th of November 1911 for 1/3 of her original purchase price. By this time, William and Amy had 2 little sons and a 3rd child on the way, and they were probably less enthusiastic about travelling on Medea with the children. But you will see pictures of the children in the dining room of Medea later on. Her second owner kept Medea for just a couple of years, and in 1914 sold her to John Stephen, the director of Alexander Stephen and Son. John was Alexander Stephen's brother. And when John Stephen died in 1917, during the Great War, Medea was first offered to the Red Cross, but ended up being sold to the French Navy. I only have a painting, but this is Medea. U-boats make us think of the Second World War, but they were also active in the English Channel during the Great War. And in 1917, the French Merchant Navy had 1,300 steamships and 1,400 ships under sail. And Medea's task was to escort merchant sailing vessels and protect them from attack by U-boats. Renamed Corneille after the 17th century poet and playwright, she had a crew of 22 men and carried a 75mm gun, 6 anti-submarine depth charges and a captive observation balloon. In 1994, Craig Arnold's book stated that there was no record that Corneille ever engaged a submarine, but in an article in the 2004 Medea issue of Mainsail Hall, Ray Ashley wrote an account of a near miss by a torpedo on the 30th of May 1917. The lookout wrote in the log, "Under such circumstances, it is regrettable to sail with a hull that bears a coat of brilliant white paint." After the Great War ended, Corneille passed to a French reserve in 1919 and was soon after sold, returned to private ownership and resumed the name Medea. After the terrorist attacks in Paris on the 13th of November 2015, when French flags were being flown in America as a show of solidarity, the Maritime Museum of San Diego displayed the tricolor on Medea, our French warship. Medea is the last remaining warship from the Great War that still runs, or at least she was a few years ago. We hope she will run again. The sideboard. Medea passed through many hands. There were 15 private owners in all, and there is nothing much to say about most of them. Her 10th owner was her own designer, Frederick John Stephen, who, according to Craig Arnold, bought Medea in 1929, the year he became chairman of Alexander Stephen and Son. Fred used Medea as the Commodore's vessel of the Royal Northern Yacht Club And at the Royal Northern and Clyde Yacht Club, there are rooms named for famous yachts, and Medea is one of them. Fred Stephen had grand ideas about changing Medea. He planned to lengthen her by 5 feet and change her from coal to oil fuel, but no major changes were actually made before his death in 1932. He did make many smaller changes. He replaced the original after skylight, which was small and square and flat-topped and about 2 feet high. He installed a new steam windlass, which is the one we have today. He removed the leather upholstered benches around the saloon and the smoking room and put wider bunks in all the staterooms. And a sideboard was installed in the saloon, which may or may not be the one in this picture. Despite Fred's ideas, Medea remained coal-fired until 1964. There's the answer someone asked me for. Rick, thank you. Right, so there you are. 1964, it was made oil-fired. So, barrage balloons. It has been brought to my attention that not everyone knows what a barrage balloon was or what it looked like. So, this picture is to give you an idea, and I believe that is Buckingham Palace underneath these barrage balloons. The British government requisitioned Medea in April 1941 and deployed her at Sheerness, which you'll see on a map in a moment. Sheerness. Oh, it's gone again. As a barrage balloon vessel. German bombers would navigate to London by following the River Thames. So the British anchored barrage balloons to moored vessels on the banks of the river. Steel cables would present a hazard for the German planes. The height and position of the balloons was changed frequently. So there's Sheerness down near the mouth of the Thames. Medea was compulsorily purchased by the War Office in September 1942 and moved to Peterhead in Scotland. This is the British town that is the closest to Norway. On the 1st of December 1942, Medea was taken over by a small secret unit of the Royal Norwegian Navy in exile. Norwegians on the bow of Medea in 1944. The Norwegians used Medea as an accommodation vessel and unofficially renamed her Hakon in honor of King Hakon VII. The tallest officer in this photograph is Carl Solveig, who was interviewed for one of the Mainsail Hall articles, and he said they never called the vessel Hakon. They always referred to her as the Yacht. During the war, Medea's hull and topsides were painted grey. The French would have been grateful. And a wheelhouse was installed. The bowsprit was removed, but the figurehead remained. The galley of Medea was used to prepare food for all the Norwegians, and something like 60 of them served at Peterhead between 1941 and 1945. This is a lovely picture. The unit was working for the British Special Intelligence Services, the forerunner of MI6. Their task was to transport spies. Norwegian fishing vessels, motor cutters, were commissioned into the Norwegian Navy and kept on standby at Peterhead. They were used to transport SIS agents and their equipment into and out of Norway. Each motor cutter had a machine gun mounted on the deck, disguised as a fuel oil drum. The journey of 250 nautical miles took about 2 days at 6 knots. The article in Mainsail Hall is quite thrilling. In this photograph, Carl Solveig is the tallest man on the bridge of Medea, and he describes this picture as like a mother duck with all her ducklings. Job Longson Wild. In November 1945, Medea was sold back to her pre-war owner, Job Longson Wild. Wild owned Medea longer than any other private individual. He owned her from 1935 to 1941, and again from 1945 until his death in 1960. And these are his children. There is an article in the Mainsail Hall by Job Longson Wild's daughter, Biddy. in which she says they took Medea to Cowes every year for the annual Royal Yacht Squadron Regatta. And her brother has the shuffleboard there. I believe they are also pictured on board the Medea. You'll see that later. There's an article in the Mainsail Hall by Joe Blonson Wilde's daughter, Biddy Wilde, Dr. Evans, as she later became. She said that all the successors boatyard at Brightlingsea, which her father owned, had mud flats suitable for mud berths for yachts in winter, where a vessel would be positioned during a spring tide and allowed to settle onto the mud flat, there to stay until the next spring tide. And Biddy Wilde was one of the friends whose passing was commemorated during the sailing of the Star of India on the 18th of November 2018. At times, Wilde used Medea as personal accommodation or to put up visiting VIPs. He had the smoking room extended, improving his comfort but spoiling Medea's looks. This, you can see, it's, well, when you see the smoking room, you'll see it's a lot smaller than this now. But this picture shows you what it was like in his time. This modification has since been reversed by Paul Whittier. We pass over a few more owners here. We skip to her last private owner, Nelson Paul Whittier. Whittier was the son of a California oil magnate. His uncle Colin founded Arco. Whittier was the son of a Californian oil magnate, and his uncle Colin, and Paul Whittier was a blue water sailor and an engineer. He recognized that steam yachts were almost, but not quite, gone. He resolved to find one that he could restore, and in 1971, he approached the then president of the Maritime Museum, Joe Jessup Sr., and he proposed to buy Medea, restore her to her original appearance, and donate her to the museum. According to Joe Jessup, Whittier was an ace mechanic who loved nothing better than to get some old boat and fix it up. Whittier had seen Medea in England in 1967, but in 1971 she was at Oskarshamn, Sweden, on the Baltic Sea south of Stockholm. Her owner was a Captain K.G. Holmberg, had given her Panamanian registration, and he had so many paintings on board that Medea was described as a floating art gallery. Whittier bought Medea and took her from Oskarshamn to Falmouth in England under her own power, and his original plan was to take her across the Atlantic under her own power as well. However, after some delays, the plan was changed so that Medea would not be steaming into the West Indies during hurricane season. In January 2023, Paul and Olive's daughter, Ladia Whittier, visited the museum, and in this picture, she's flanked by her children, Amanda and Paul. So, Medea went to Rotterdam in June 1971 and was loaded on the German container ship Riederstein, which carried her across the Atlantic, through the Panama Canal, and on to Long Beach, arriving during the Longshoremen's strike in August 1971. Ken Renard was her captain for the onward journey to the boatyard on Goodge Island, Whittier's private island in British Columbia. Notice, we've got a lot of people who own private islands in this story. It's all about rich guys, what can I tell you? Look at this picture. The extended smoking room and the big funnel, okay? Whittier had Medea restored using the specifications and details from her original plans. 2 small auxiliary diesel engines and a heating boiler were removed. One of the diesel engines had been used as part of the fuel oil atomizing system. The other generated electricity. Both were replaced with steam engines. The modern funnel was replaced with the big modern funnel was replaced with a smaller one, more like the original funnel. The hull was sandblasted, 15% of the bottom plating was replaced, as were some sections of the framing. Teak logs were imported from Burma and milled for new decks. Rotten wooden trail boards were photographed and recreated, and a new figurehead was carved. A stove and an icebox from the appropriate period were installed in the galley. For Medea's last ocean voyage, from British Columbia to San Diego, Ken Renard was the captain and Paul Whittier was in the crew. Medea's arrival in San Diego was accompanied by 100 small craft. The formal presentation to the Maritime Museum took place at the San Diego Yacht Club on the 14th of July 1973. Among the attendees was a Mr. T.R. Evans, the managing director of Alexander Stephens, whose father had worked on Medea's original construction. Go quiet. What's happening?
You talked it out.
What's happening? Well, I'll just have to speak up. So, where are we? That's her arrival. Mr. Evans presented the museum with a spacing knife that was used in her construction. I don't know who it was given to, and we don't know where it is, but it's here somewhere. Restoration and transportation had cost Whittier over $300,000. Bob McNeil, the previous owner of Hangada, told me in 2010 that he stopped counting at 12 million for Hangada. Okay, Medea at the museum. Oh dear. Medea continued to have Panamanian registry until 1977. The United States Coast Guard approved her for harbour excursions, but not for seagoing and not for paying passengers. In 1989, the Coast Guard refused to issue a certificate of inspection for Medea because the hull had deteriorated. From February to August 1990, the museum completed a major hull restoration, sandblasting followed by hand scraping to bare metal inside and out. A few frames were replaced or sistered. The bilges were modified to restrict water to a single bilge pocket. The inside was treated with epoxy primer and finished with polyurethane paint. The outside was repaired using an experimental vinyl resin, of which more later. In 2017, the after deck was removed and fairly extensive restoration was performed on Medea's hull below the after deck and below the floor of the guest cabins. I believe John Serbian did the welding work repairing her hull. The museum used to take Medea out on the bay several times a year, with a captain, 2 engineers, and half a dozen deckhands. The last time she sailed was 2017. She couldn't have sailed in 2020 or 2021 anyway because of COVID-19. During the shutdown, Jake Williams, also of whom more later, chief engineer at the Antique Gas and Steam Engine Museum, worked on Medea's engine along with the MMSD crew. According to Jim Davis, there were repairs to the internal piping of the boiler, the general service pump, and the engine bilge was cleaned. In 2023, the museum launched an appeal to raise funds to repair Medea's boiler, and that work was expected to cost $100,000. I believe they did get the money, but again, more of that later. Yes, so, back again. That, Medea's hull is now in a very sorry condition. And I heard that there are plans to extend the vinyl coating from the 1990 restoration to the upper part of the hull. Thank you. This hole in the hull, you can see it down there at the bottom. And that's it from the inside. It's right through the hull. This picture was one that I took of Medea's 4 staterooms in 2006. It doesn't look like that today. This is an intact deck beam inside Medea, which we took recently. You can see the deck beams. This picture is upside down so that you can read that it's Lanarkshire steel. You can't read them on all of them, like this one. They tore out the paneling, they tore out the ceiling in those lovely staterooms, and this is the kind of thing that they found. Thank you. Now, I have spoken with Jake Williams, and I hope he will come and join us this morning and tell us a bit more about her state. I asked him to come at 10:45. So we will come back to the state of the deck beads and such things. So, let's go back to prettier times. In 2010, when Kangarda's restoration was complete and they were moving her from the Pacific Northwest to her new home in Mystic, she stopped en route in San Diego and a quote, quote, race was staged between the two steam yachts. Now, Kangarda has a triple expansion steam engine and she could have run away from Medea any time. But since it was really more of a photo op, Kangarda restrained her speed. At the last turn, where Medea had the inside of the turn, engineer Jim Davis brought up her best turn of speed, and we crossed the finish line first. We won. So, and I can never resist a little bit of self-puffery here. This picture was taken after the steam yacht race, left to right. Captain David Evans of Kangarda, Margaret Clark, and Captain Chris Welton of Medea, standing on the foredeck of Medea. So, I have been chairman since 2016, but I wasn't chairman then, so there you go. And my last slide is enjoying Medea. Medea accompanied the Star of India for her 150th anniversary sail in 2013. And since there were no passengers, the deck crew decided to have a little fun and dress up for the occasion. I made the foolish mistake of asking if I could go with them, and they said no. So, I am represented by my tablecloth and my champagne bucket. So, the MMSD crew on Medea during the Star Sail of 2013 are in the front row Tad Menino, Sally Haggerty, Stanley Williams, and Nancy Hump, and the back row David Clark and Ken Kaltoff. And I like the juxtaposition of these two pictures. Amy McAllister Hall with her friends in 1910, and museum crew having fun in 2013. So together, they show that Medea is and always has been a pleasure. Now, that is the end of my talk, but I did ask Jake if he could be here at 10:45, which is in 5 minutes. So perhaps we'll take a break. Since, yes? Bob?
For the trainees specifically, and actually for any of the docents now, the Mainsail Hall that Margaret is talking about is available on our website. You'll see a line there that says Mainsail Hall web access or something to that effect. And you can pull it up and read this, everything Margaret was talking about, plus other stuff, great pictures, etc.
The stuff about the Norwegian escapade was really exciting. I recommend reading it. Yes?
Has they ever used the Medea in any Hollywood movies?
Not that I know of.
Okay.
Anyone else? Yes. Good.
I talked to the captain of Kangarda when he was here.
Yes.
He showed me all the build plans that he had obtained from
Yes.
Kangarda that built it. Quite amazing stuff. That's how he restored it.
Yes.
He told me the most expensive part of his restorations was the custom curved glass windows in the front of the deck house.
I also heard, I believe he told me, that they scanned the hull and rebuilt it. They created the hull for Kangarda. Kristen?
One of your photos that enclosed pilot house that they built.
Yes.
When did that come out?
Now you're asking me. I don't actually know. It would certainly have been taken off in the 70s when Whittier did his restoration. I don't know if it was taken off before that.
In that Rotterdam picture, I didn't see
It's still there.
It is still there. Yeah, so in fact it was there. Thank you. Thank you, Nikki. That was well spotted. Sarah, you had a question? Okay. Okay. Well done.
So you have someone who's going to come and speak?
Yes, I was hoping that Jake Williams would join us at 10:45 and give us 5 minutes about the current state of Medea. So we could take a break for 10 minutes.
So let's take a 10-minute break and then come.
Good morning, friends. For those of you who have not met me, I'm Jake Williams. I'm the museum's maintenance director, and for the last 5 years, I've been heading up the restoration efforts on the Medea. And Margaret asked me to come up and spend a few minutes telling you where we are with those efforts. At this point, the largest recent development has been the removal of the cabin interiors. So it's not worth going down there. There is nothing to see. We had to do this to gain access to the interior shell plating, deck beams, and frame structure of the vessel to make a detailed survey and come up with a roadmap for necessary repairs. Those are going to be extensive. I came here 5 years ago thinking I needed to get the boiler recertified, get a couple of knocks out of the steam engines, and I came to realize that those are the least of Medea's problems. Steam plant's not much good without a boat to put it in, so we kind of redirected ourselves to fixing the boat, and then we'll circle back to fixing the steam plant. The boiler is not as bad a situation as I think it's been implied to be. It can operate at 100 psi, although that compound engine of hers wants at least 125 psi to be happy and allow me enough residual steam to run my generator. So I have actually opened a dialogue with a local boiler manufacturer up in Oceanside who I am very optimistic is going to set us up with a very good deal, perhaps even a donation on a replacement boiler, which will give me 150 pounds and high fuel efficiency to work with. So the idea of being able to get 100 RPM out of that engine is the hot rodder in me just grins every time I think about it. So I'm not sure what Margaret has told you about the history of the vessel. I'm just kind of here to give you a brief status report on the restoration, and got a couple minutes to answer any questions you may have regarding that. David.
Jake, Margaret showed us photos of some of the deck beams, some of which were intact, and the Lanarkshire mill marks will be red, and some of which are extremely not intact. Maybe you can talk a little bit about the situation with the beams and the hull.
So the situation with the beams and the hull is the deck was last replaced 45 years ago. So it's had a good run, but it is time to do it again. And unfortunately, the margin boards and the waterways were the very first things to breach. During rainstorms, water would make its way under the margin boards and run down the inside of the skin of the ship. Ignorance is bliss. This was all hidden behind wooden paneling, and we didn't know how deep that particular rabbit hole went until the captain of the pilot one day said, "You have a new porthole."
They've seen it. Yeah.
So I went over there and I said, "Oh my, there's a hole in the hull," and Sandra Fettel said, "There's a song in there somewhere." So what has happened is, as the deck has aged, water has permeated its way through, and the wood paneling has trapped it against the steel, and it has eaten away at the deck beam frames and the shell plating. And there are a few of these beams that I refer to as endless deck beams because they have no ends anymore. They're not connected to the hull. How is everything holding together? I'm going to say habit. But what is kind of special about this project is I've got a dedicated crew of misfits, including myself, who Medea is kind of our obsession. She's our drug, she's our addiction, and that's what we spend our volunteer time doing. And we've got Chris Welton and Dave Kaltoff, who have reverse engineered her back to a set of plans. We're conducting a survey, and we are putting together what I think is a very workable plan to repair the hull. And I know this is a commonly asked question, so I'm going to answer it preemptively. Yes, the plan absolutely is to make her sail again.
Good. Yay!
Plenty. Exactly. If I was going to make everything as beautiful and wonderful as it could be, I'd be looking for about $6 million top to bottom. Now, can we do it with less? Yeah, we can. It depends on how far we want to go with it. But my perhaps misguided belief has been, well, we raised that to build San Salvador. We can raise that to overhaul the Medea. The money's out there. This is San Diego. We just need to attract the people and their wallets with the right carrot to come and contribute to us.
Okay. Well, thank you, Jake.
Thank you.
So if any of you would love to have
Now I'm
your,
off to the hardware store.
love to have you see your picture on the Medea.
See, I name dropped you.
Where our opportunities.
I'm not good at
Okay, so now we're going to be talking about the Californian. I want to introduce Professor Emeritus, Doctor, Captain of many years of the Californian, and I just ordered Reverend? Oh. Anyway, Carl Scragg.
The river was just to, so that I could marry my nephews. I will be talking. That's the go button. There. That's the go button. Okay, great. I'll be talking about Californian. She is our replica ship of an 1848 revenue cutter. So this presentation, I've chopped it into about 4 parts. First, I'll be talking about the Revenue Marine Service because a whole lot of people, most of our guests have never heard of it. So we ought to know a little bit about what that was. I'll be talking about one particular revenue cutter, C.W. Lawrence, who had a very interesting part in California history. Then I'll be talking about our replica ship, Californian, how we came together and where she stands now. And then finally, the last part of this is kind of from my perspective as a naval architect, it's a history of ship design and how these ships, which are all in the class of Baltimore Clippers, how that was a major divergence from where ship design had been going for the previous 300 years or so. Revenue Marine Service. Right after the Revolutionary War, Alexander Hamilton was our first Secretary of the Treasury, and guess what? He inherited a major war debt. He had $75 million he had to pay off. Now, Congress had imposed import duties, tariffs on all imports, because that's how they raised money in those days. And Alexander Hamilton was savvy enough to know that these American traders were pretty good at smuggling and probably weren't going to be paying the tariffs unless we had some way to enforce it. So he asked Congress to fund the building of 10 clipper ships, Baltimore Clippers, to enforce the tariffs on the East Coast. That was the establishment of the Revenue Marine Service. It was established in 1790. You may hear me call it the Revenue Service, the Revenue Marine Service, the Revenue Clipper Service, Revenue Cutter Service. These guys didn't settle up on a name for 100 years, and finally, at the end of the 19th century, they said it was the Revenue Cutter Service. Anyway, primary duties of the Revenue Cutters: suppress smuggling and to collect the tariffs. Now, the colonists had become very, very good smugglers. They didn't want to pay those tariffs to King George, and they became very adept at it. And Alexander Hamilton knew they would use those same techniques to avoid paying their taxes to now President George. So he had to have a fleet of revenue cutters. They were going to enforce these taxes. They had to be armed. They better be pretty fast, because a lot of the smugglers were sailing pretty fast ships. A lot of the smuggling actually went on over the horizon. It was common for ships to come in, and start offloading cargo to a bunch of smaller vessels, which would then scatter into the rivers of Margaret and various inlets. So you had to be able to sail over the horizon to do some interdiction on these things. So your ship had to be seaworthy. It also had to be capable of going into these inlets and harbors and places where smuggling was going on. These were all revenue cutters. They were all of a form we'll call Baltimore Clippers, and I'll talk more about that later. This is the photo I found, the oldest photo I could find of a revenue cutter. And this is the Gallatin. She was commissioned in 1830. We get the question all the time, what's a cutter? Fair question. Right? Now, in sailing parlance, among sailors, that's a description of a type of rig. A cutter is typically a smaller vessel. It's characterized by this great big jibboom and multiple headsails tacked onto the jibboom. You can see here the Gallatin's got 3 headsails onto that massive jibboom sticking out there. They were often single-masted vessels, but all the revenue cutters were 2-masted. Anyway, I got this photo from a history of the Revenue Service that was entitled Cold, Wet, and Thoroughly Miserable, and I think that's a pretty good description. Now, the confusion that people have today is the Coast Guard has adopted the name cutter for all their commissioned ships. So if you talk to somebody in the Coast Guard, well, what's a cutter? Well, it's white and it's over 65 feet, that makes it a cutter. Okay, you talk to sailors, well, no, it's a description of a rig. So there is a real confusion there. Responsibilities of the Revenue Service. Not only did they have to collect the taxes and suppress that smuggling that was going on, but they became responsible for protecting U.S. shipping. So they had to stomp out the piracy. They also became involved in slave interdiction. Slave trade had been outlawed, and it fell to the Revenue Service to stop that. They also, as a coastal service, became responsible for charting all the coastlines. And so they were, laying out what was there for other skippers to know where was safe to go and where wasn't. They also ended up with the duties that often fall to harbor masters, things like quarantine restrictions and embargo and neutrality acts that fell to the Revenue Cutter Service. And in mid-19th century, Congress gave them responsibility for assisting vessels in distress. If that's starting to sound a little bit like the Coast Guard, well, finally in 1915, the Revenue Cutter Service was merged with Life Saving Service to create the U.S. Coast Guard. Now, the Coast Guard can draw a direct line back to the founding of the Revenue Marine Service in 1790, and the Coast Guard therefore claims to be the oldest continuously active maritime service. Part 2, I'm going to shift to a discussion of one particular revenue cutter, C.W. Lawrence. Wonderful painting. Those of you who have been paying attention to rigs and so forth, I know that she's rigged as a brig. I'm going to talk about that a little bit later. Now, she was one of 7 Campbell-class Baltimore Clippers that were built to replace ships that were lost in the Mexican War. Okay? Now, who was C.W. Lawrence, and how did he get a ship named after him? Well, this distinguished-looking gentleman in your upper right, Cornelius Von Wick Lawrence. He was the first collector of customs in the port of New York. He later became mayor of New York. He later became a congressman from New York. I had quite a resume, and I guess it's not so surprising they named a ship after him. But of more importance to our story is this fellow in the lower left, Alexander Fraser. He was the commandant of the Revenue Cutter Service at the time that C.W. Lawrence was being constructed. He oversaw construction of the ship, and then interestingly, he became her first captain, and he was the one who sailed her around Cape Horn to San Francisco. And I think there's got to be a story there, because you wouldn't really expect the commandant of the cutter service to be doing a delivery, but he did. Now, major events in the late 1840s. U.S. acquired a lot of coastline on the West Coast. We had the Oregon Treaty in 1846, where the U.S. acquired the land that was the Oregon Territory and the Washington Territory. And then in 1848, we had the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. I'm probably butchering the name. But that was the end of hostilities with the Mexican-American War, and the United States acquired all the land that is now California. So suddenly, in this real short period, they acquired 1,300 miles of new coastline, and it was time to get somebody out there to patrol this coastline. They had to chart it, they had to assist the mariners, enforce maritime law, and of course, secure the revenue. Do all the things that the Revenue Service was supposed to be doing. C.W. Lawrence was the very first revenue cutter to make it to the Pacific Coast. As I said earlier, she's a Campbell-class Baltimore clipper. One of several in the Campbell class that were built to replace the ships lost in the Mexican-American War. She was built in Foggy Bottom in Washington, D.C. If you're familiar with that, that's about where the Kennedy Center sits today. There was once a boatyard there.
Yep.
She was launched August 20th, 1848. There's some confusion about when the keel was actually laid down. It was either late 1847 or early 1848, not really sure on that one. We know she sailed to California mid-November of 1848. I love this painting. Dorothy Spangler did this depiction of San Francisco, 1847-1848. At that time, it was an idyllic little village, really, in Yerba Buena Cove. And that entire year, only 6 ships visited San Francisco Bay. I've seen different reports on the population of San Francisco, 400, 500, 600, but surely less than 1,000. So I'm just saying, less than 1,000. Okay? But there were some major events that were about to happen. There was a discovery of gold in the early 1848. It was going to kind of change things around. Now, this is the trip C.W. Lawrence took. And she left very late in 1848. Brand new ship that put her out into the Atlantic was immediately hit by 2 storms. Got busted up a little bit. They had to put it into Rio for repairs. We also find out that Captain Fraser was a pretty tough taskmaster. He had a bunch of crew members he didn't much care for. There were some people who got positions on that ship, apparently by the method of political spoils. He didn't want them on his ship. He left them in Rio. He picked up more crew in Rio. But more importantly, it took them 2 months to do the repairs in Rio. So by the time they get set off, heading down, go around Cape Horn, it's starting to head towards winter. The weather was not good. They spent 5 weeks tacking into waves, wind, trying to get around Cape Horn. They got busted up pretty good. So they did what ships normally did when they go around Cape Horn and they need a lot of repairs. They put into Valparaiso in Chile. Valparaiso had a good boatyard. Okay? They pulled into Valparaiso to do repairs, discovered that the shipyard was deserted. All the shipyard workers had taken off with gold fields. And this was probably the first indication of what they were in for. They had to do a whole bunch of repairs themselves. Ship's crew did repairs at Valparaiso. Again, Captain Fraser got rid of some guys that he didn't think were performing well enough, and he replaced them with a few more. The next leg was up to Honolulu, and it's confusing, and I wish we had right here a good map of what the trade winds do. But the trade winds will sweep you north along the coast of South America, get up towards the equator, it pushes you to the west. You get into the northern Pacific, it pushes you north, right up to Honolulu. So that's just riding the elevator up to Honolulu. Okay? Where they reprovisioned, they picked up some more crew, put off some more people that Captain Fraser didn't like, and finally they headed for San Francisco. people ask all the time, well, how many crew did she have when she went around Cape Horn? And I went, I don't know. She started with 43, we know that. And then they kept putting people off and putting people on. It was probably somewhere between the 20s and the 40s, but, you know, depended upon which leg of the voyage we're talking about. Let's look at the timeline for 1848, because it got pretty chaotic here. Gold was discovered in January. You all know the story. They tried to keep it quiet for a while, and that lasted about a month. The word started to leak out. Okay? By midsummer, the word of the gold discovery had spread across the Pacific. And anybody who could get to a vessel that was heading for San Francisco was jumping on board and heading for the gold fields. So there was this gold rush that was starting in the summer of 1848. And those gold seekers were referred to as Argonauts, and they were coming in by ship. Meanwhile, construction was going on C.W. Lawrence, and she gets launched in the summertime, late summer. In the fall of that year, rumors of the gold discovery were just beginning to reach the East Coast. So we don't know how much the crew knew about it, but we can bet they didn't know much about it. President Polk finally announced the discovery of gold in December after C.W. Lawrence had already sailed. When they arrived, that idyllic little cove in Yerba Buena was now cluttered with shacks and makeshift housing, and the bay is cluttered with ships. Argonauts were arriving at the rate of about 1,000 a week. This is a community that only had 1,000 a year before. There were like 500 or 600 ships in the bay, some of them anchored poorly. Another shot I love of the bay is you're looking kind of north up towards Angel Island. And it's just like it's a forest of masts. And these ships have been abandoned. In many cases, they were very poorly anchored. Crews were known to just get off the ship, take the longboat, and go to the gold fields, and not even worry about offloading passengers or cargo. Just leave people to their own devices. So it was a mess. 1850, San Francisco had been called the most lawless city on earth. The gold rush brought in all manner of people, and with them, all manner of criminal activity came in. There was a U.S. Marshal, and I think he had 4 deputies. He's got 1,000 arrivals per week. I think he was a little overwhelmed. On the bay, we've got crews abandoning their ships and just leaving these ships in the bay. Some of these ships were so poorly anchored, they were ripping their anchors loose and drifting about the bay. C.W. Lawrence was rammed 5 times her first year. These things are just floating around. There were inadequate crew to man outgoing vessels. So even if you had a captain who wanted to continue his voyage, he was having trouble getting crew so he could go on. So the crew of C.W. Lawrence would go over and help him. We'll help you get up your anchor, we'll help you get your sails up, we'll help you get out of here. Okay? So they had all kinds of crazy responsibility. But finding crew became so difficult that captains were resorting to the use of crimps. And these are guys who would get you a crew by whatever means necessary for a price, and often the crew was knocked over the head or drugged or otherwise just dumped on board. This practice of shanghaiing was so common at this time there were 20 gangs involved in this activity in San Francisco. C.W. Lawrence was the only police sort of force on the West Coast. So they had enough of a problem, but then her officers and crews started running off the gold field, so he's not even able to hang on to his own guys. Okay? It reached the point where he didn't have enough crew to sail C.W. Lawrence. He had to anchor C.W. Lawrence in the bay if she became a floating jail. Now, he did acquire 2 smaller vessels so he could still patrol the bay and try to continue his activities. But talk about being overwhelmed, it was just horrible. Finally, in September of 1850, Revenue Mark Polk arrived. Reinforcements, finally. Okay? The Polk took over the responsibility for the bay. The Californian, which they believed to be a more seaworthy, not Californian, C.W. Lawrence, excuse me, was believed to be a more seaworthy vessel. So she continued now the process of, let's go patrol the West Coast and see what we acquire with this new coastline, and do all of the duties that the Revenue Cutter Service is supposed to be doing. So she sails from San Francisco down the West Coast, into the Channel Islands. We know she put into Cat Harbor in Catalina. And we know she came into San Diego. We believe that she anchored somewhere near Old Town. She stayed there for a few days, returned to Honolulu by way, returned to San Francisco by way of Honolulu, which was, you'll hear this again and again, that's the normal way to get from San Diego up to Honolulu, to San Francisco, was to head west, then head north, to loop back in on the trades. Yeah, it's the best way to do it. Okay?
You want to enjoy it.
So finally, they came back to San Francisco, and Captain Fraser had enough, and he put in a request for leave, requested to be relieved of his duty, and Doug Zocher took over, replaced him as captain of C.W. Lawrence. And C.W. Lawrence continued to patrol the West Coast until late November of 1851, returning from Monterey. They came back to the Golden Gate. Ebb tide was flowing out the gate. The waves were pushing in, and the wind was light, so they didn't have much control. Not likely to get into the bay, so they decided they were going to anchor. And they anchored right off Point Lobos. And if you're familiar with San Francisco, it's where the Cliff House restaurant is, a wonderful place to have a drink. It's where the Sutro Baths used to be. It's not a good place to have your boat. It's really, really nasty, rocky sort of place there. It was getting kind of scary during the night. They decided they had to reposition the boat. Anchor cable parted. They then hoisted sails and tried to sail her out of there. The wind wasn't enough to give them the power, and the waves and the tide pushed her onto the beach just south of Point Lobos. And it's about where the San Francisco Zoo is today. So she ended up on the beach, stuck well into the sand. She was in shallow water, so they were able to salvage most of the equipment. But the hull was stuck there and was a total loss. Of course, there was an inquiry, and Captain Oninger was absolved of all blame. It was just like, well, it happens. Now we're going to tell you about our revenue cutter, replica ship, Californian. Those of you with an eagle eye will notice, oh, she's not a bark. She's a topsail schooner. Well, these Campbell-class Baltimore clippers, some were rigged as topsail schooners and some were rigged as barks. Brigs. Excuse me. Thank you. And it was decided to rig Californian as a topsail schooner just because it's easier to handle. Now, the Nautical Heritage Society, founded in 1982 by Steve and Julia Christmas. They had a dream that they would build a tall ship that could represent something of California's history, that could represent California in various tall ship festivals. They wanted to be able to use it for sail training and teach people about marine ecology. And they wanted to lead the boat parade into the Olympic Games in 1984. They were able to raise $2.5 million for design and construction with this ship. And they were able to hire Melbourne Smith, who's done a lot of replica ships, very well known in this field. They were able to hire him to take on the project. Word of this effort, as they were looking around at what would be a good ship to build. And word got to the Coast Guard Academy, because the people of the Coast Guard Academy had said, we got a deal for you. Not only was C.W. Lawrence very important and had a place in California history, but we've got the lines. C.W. Lawrence is a Campbell-class Baltimore clipper. We've retained the lines. Not very often when you build a replica ship do you have a complete set of lines. And this is like, wow, it's better than Christmas. I think it probably took them just a few minutes to decide that's what we're going to build. Okay, so C.W. Lawrence was selected for that reason. Now, if you're going to build a historic ship, you need a historic spot. Well, Cassidy Lawrence had come into San Diego Bay and anchored off Old Town, not very far from Spanish Landing. They were able to get the Port Commission to lease them the land to basically build a boatyard on Spanish Landing for $1 a year. It was a great deal. Well, the keel was actually laid, I believe, on the 4th of July in 1983. But even before you lay the keel, there's a certain amount of foundation work you've got to do to prepare the land so that you can build this thing. And in this shot, here's the guys that were trenching the building site, laying out the beams that were, ultimately what the ship was going to be constructed on top of. And Spanish Landing is just off Harbor Drive, right down here by the airport. And here's this great big wooden moat going up next to the road, and it's attracting a lot of attention. And people are going, "What's that? What is going on here?" And people would stop and see what was going on, ask questions, and so on and so forth. Nautical Heritage Society decided to take advantage of this. And they actually put up bleachers so people would have a place to stop and watch the construction. A lot of people would come by and have lunchtime there. And Nautical Heritage Society said, you know what we ought to do? We ought to get some volunteers who can stand there and talk to these people about what's going on. How do you build a wooden ship? What's going to be done with this project? They call them watchkeepers. And I think we would call them docents. Now this picture I like. This is the driving in of the whiskey plank. If you're not familiar with that term, when you're building a wooden ship, the final plank that you put in is called the whiskey plank, and you typically find the biggest dignitary you can to drive the spikes in on the whiskey plank. And here they got Admiral Gracie, the Coast Guard Commandant, to drive in the whiskey plank. And this is a major milestone in the building of a wooden ship. So the boatyard workers are pretty happy and have been known to partake of a certain amount of adult beverage, and thus we have the term whiskey plank. Now, if you're going to have a great historic ship that's going to represent California, you've got to have a great figurehead, right? Well, our figurehead comes really from a story, early 1500s, a Spanish romance novel. It was a very well-read, well-received novel, and it speaks of an island. It's populated by beautiful, dark-skinned women who are very ferocious warriors. They lived without men on this island. And the most beautiful and the most fierce of them all was Queen Calafia. And their island was called California. So it just made sense that Queen Calafia had to be the figurehead for California. Here we have pictures of, first they were modeled in clay and then carved in wood. And of course somebody had the model for this. They managed to get Catherine Bach, if you guys can remember Dukes of Hazzard. I think most of you are old enough to remember that. She modeled for the figurehead. And in this picture, you'll notice that the figurehead is painted in lifelike colors, which I really like, rather than the pasty white that we've got on there now. But then nobody asked me, so. Anyway. Next picture, launch day. Whenever I see this, it reminds me of sort of sage advice I received when I was in school. The professor said on launch day, make sure that you are out of town and unavailable for comment. And I hope these guys had a professor give them similar advice, because on launch day, they had Californian up on a cradles on the trailer. They got a big tractor truck to push her back into the bay. She started to roll back into the bay. The wheels of the trailer started to sink in the soft sand. She started to tilt precipitously. They thought she was going to capsize right there. And this is in front of about 10,000 people. The governor's wife, Gloria DePagian, was there to christen the vessel. Of course, the press was there. You know, not a good time to have a mistake like that. Somebody was thinking quickly and got the tractor trailer in reverse, pulled her back up onto firmer sand. Everybody took a deep breath and said, oh my God, now what? Now, in what I regard as probably the last great piece of political cooperation in our history, They required the city police, the city council, the Coast Guard, the Harbor Commission. We had to get SDG&E involved. Okay, they towed her down Harbor Drive to the Coast Guard station, so they had to have Coast Guard sign in on this. They had to trim trees. They had to take down power lines. Okay, they towed her down Harbor Drive that same day. That evening, they towed her down Harbor Drive to the Coast Guard station. And here she is the very next morning, the Coast Guard station, and she was launched on the seaplane ramps there. And they had an even bigger crowd that day because of all the press that got the day before for their embarrassing situation. And then here we have them at the opening of the '84 Olympic Games. And she is leading the boat parade into Long Beach. And they managed to really, in 1 year, go from laying the keel to sailing at the beginning of the boat parade. I think it was an incredible accomplishment. Now, Nautical Heritage Society sailed California for 18 years. They put on almost 500,000 miles. She was the tall ship ambassador for the state of California. She was representing California in tall ship festivals all over the country. She went to the East Coast, I think, 3 times. She sailed to Hawaii 4 times. She was up to Canada, down to Mexico, through the Panama Canal in the Caribbean. They claim to stop in 28 ports in California. I can't name 28 ports in California. I'll just take the word for it. But let's just say she sailed a lot and had a long and very, very successful life. Now, after 18 years, it starts to get expensive and difficult to keep a wooden boat sailing. Nautical Heritage Society was falling on hard times. They offered California up for sale. Now, the Potiphar family, been involved with the Maritime Museum here for quite some time. They had a daughter who had sailed on California in one of the sail training programs. And their daughter had just fallen in love with the ship. And the Potiphar family said, you know, somebody ought to save that ship. So they arranged a purchase. They donated the ship to the Maritime Museum of San Diego. They did put on the stipulation that they had to continue the educational programs. So that's part of the charter of California, that she has to be used as an educational ship. That was at the time the largest single donation the Maritime Museum had ever received. But what we received was an 18-year-old ship that was not in good shape, and it was very difficult to sail. But the Maritime Museum managed to get a $300,000 grant from the Coastal Conservancy. So they were able to replace auxiliary systems that needed to be replaced, they needed to fix things that needed to be fixed. They hauled her out, they got all new sails, they painted her up, they fixed her up, they got her in ship shape. It took over a year, but they did it. And suddenly we had a ship that was in really good shape. She continues to sail. The educational programs, I got a couple shots here that were taken during Ronsels. And Peter, when are you going to get us our Ronsels going again?
We're working on it, yeah.
Great, great program. We had a lot of fun with these kids, but it really fell off after the pandemic.
Could I just introduce Peter DeSimone, the director of the museum's education department?
More Ronsels, yes.
Yes, more Ronsels. The kids love it, and you know the docents love it. The crew loves it. Really great fun. We got this picture here, upper left. This is Lynn Eddy, long-time volunteer and sail crew. She was teaching knots to the kids as we were sailing around the bay. And the lower right, Captain Chris Walton is showing kids how to steer this vessel. And steering a tall ship's a lot of fun. A lot of these kids have never even been in any kind of boat before. And they remember this for years. I mean, it's a great thrill for these kids, and it's a program that we want to support in any way we can. And it's too bad the pandemic kind of put a hiccup in there, but we'll get it going again. Now she continues to sail on the coast. Here's a picture that Captain James Thayer took this picture. He recognizes it. We were sailing up the coast. We were trying to get around Point Dumais. We were beating into some waves and some wind. She's great for the sailing conditions like this. That ship comes to life in about 15 knots of breeze, but she's not a dry boat. I'll tell you that. You better bring your fowlies.
Go to Hawaii, I'm telling you.
Yeah, she's a wonderful, wonderful ship. Now I'm going to shift gears again here. We're talking about Baltimore Clippers without ever telling you what's a Baltimore Clipper. So I'll try to talk about that. Why do I love Baltimore Clippers? I think it's got a very special place in the development of naval architecture and ship design. I regard the Baltimore Clipper as the first uniquely American contribution to ship design. It was a place where there was a fork in the road. Traditional shipbuilding went on one fork, American shipbuilders took the other fork. Okay? So we were going off in a different direction. So usually when we identify ships, we identify them by their rig. We say that's a brig or a bark or a full rig ship, or a schooner or whatever. Okay? Because that's the first thing you see when a ship comes over the horizon. You see the sails first. Okay? What is distinctly different about the Baltimore Clipper is what's underwater, the parts you can't see so well. But that's one of the reasons that she sails so well. So let's talk a little bit about that. This one here, this photo is Pride of Baltimore, and Baltimore Clippers are known for carrying a lot of sail. There is no ship that can be identified as the first Baltimore Clipper. There are hundreds of these things that were built. They're built in Baltimore, in New York, and Boston, Newport, Rhode Island, Baltimore. I mean, just all up and down the East Coast, they were building this kind of ship. They found that it works. This is a direction that actually works. So let's talk about a few things that are a little different. One, okay, they carried a lot of sail, and they tended to have, pretty highly rigged masts. But if we look at the hull in this picture, you'll notice that the keel is not parallel to the waterline. It's sloped at a pretty radical angle. So her draft at the stern is much greater than her draft at the bow. Really important characteristic of Baltimore Clippers. If we look at the lines of the Baltimore Clipper, you suddenly realize that's a very V-shaped hull. It's not the rounded U-shape that people have been building for 300 years. This is very sharp V. Okay? It also had very fine bows. They didn't have the full rounded bow shape that had been the tradition, but they had very fine entry angles in the bow. What does that do for you? Well, the V-shaped hull. The V-shaped hull will not slide sideways as easily as a U-shaped hull. Okay? It reduces leeway, increases the resistance to lateral motion. Basically, that's going to help you go upwind. What does that fine entry do? Well, it actually moves the center of buoyancy aft, which gives you better motions when you're going into head seas. And that fine entry will cut through the seas where the big blunt bow, you'll hit those head seas and it'll just stop you. So these are all things that improve your ability to go upwind and improve your ability to operate in the seaway. The trade-off with that V-shaped hull greatly reduced cargo capacity. Every ship design is just a product of the mission requirements. So there's no such thing as the best ship. It's just the best ship for a particular requirement. Now, for the longest time, ships have been built in these very round shapes. I've got here a drawing of Surprise. You can see how rounded her shape is. If you look down at the lines below, you can see how blunt her bow is. In the age of exploration, people didn't know where they were going or how long they were going to be gone, so they wanted to carry as much supplies as they possibly could. Cargo carrying capability was like primary importance. Warships, you wanted to have as many guns as you could and as many guys to fight as you could. Again, cargo carrying capability was very, very important. Guys had learned how to sail in the trade winds. They'd learned the circular patterns of the winds in both the Atlantic and the Pacific. They could navigate around the world. hardly ever have to sail upwind. So there was not much emphasis on upwind sailing. They do just fine sailing in the trades. So the shape of the hulls, it met their purpose. It did what they needed to do. And so the design line was remarkably unchanged for like 300 years. And I love this picture painting. This is Fernando Oliveira. He actually painted this on top of the, painting of the hull. But this was the mantra of ship designers. That the hull should have a cod's head and a mackerel's tail. They thought that a ship should be built with this big blunt bow, a nice smooth streamlined tail, and that was the way ships were built for like 300 years. Then we got to the colonies. Well, they had different requirements, okay? We had people sailing up and down the Chesapeake, and if you've ever been in Chesapeake, it's like 200 miles of inlets and sandbars and shifting winds and all kinds of nasty things. You better have a maneuverable ship. I wouldn't want to take a full-rig ship up to Chesapeake. I know people have done it, but it would not have been fun, and you were probably catching your anchors a good bit of the time. The colonists were looking at moving their cargoes to market. So they were looking at short trips versus long ocean voyages. And their cargo requirements were very much smaller. They just wanted to gather up what they had grown, all the tobacco from our fields, and let's just get it to market. Okay? So the cargo requirements were smaller. And as I said, real premium on maneuverability. I also think that the fact that you had a bunch of amateur boat builders who weren't following the tradition in the European method of having the journeyman shipwright leaning over the apprentice telling him cod's head and mackerel's tail. Had guys who were willing to try things to see what would work. Now, I showed you this picture earlier. These are the first 3 frames on Californian going up. And you can see how V-shaped that hull is if we look at the way those frames are coming into the keelson there. You'll hear these things called sharp cut. And that reference is to the sharp angle between the frames and the keelson. Okay? And it forms a very V-shaped hull. What about the interior frames of California? Again, distinctly V-shaped. If we compare that to the frames on San Salvador, now you see the difference between the U-shaped frames, V-shaped frames. You can see how much greater is the carrying capacity of those U-shaped frames. Okay? Different ships, different missions. Here we go back to that picture the day they're going to launch California, but I wanted to point out to you, look at how sharp that bow is. You compare that to the big rounded bows that you had no surprise in San Salvador, it's very sharp. And that fineness of the entry, it actually shows the center buoyancy back, and I guess just from looking at the picture, center buoyancy is somewhere between the foremast and the mainmast. These ships could sail really well. The War of 1812 was the time they demonstrated their superior sailing performance. The British had blockaded the seaboard, had their warships with their massive guns keeping our guys from coming and going. But there were more than 50 blockade runners that were running Baltimore clippers. They were easily evading this blockade just by let's sail around them, let's stay out of the range of their gun. And it became known as the paper blockade. They didn't take it too seriously. And one particularly audacious skipper decided to take his boat, sail over to England, put a couple of his crew ashore, and they nailed a proclamation up on the door of Lloyd's of London and announced that the entire British Isles were under their blockade. And we laugh about it. But in 3 months, he captured and destroyed 18 British ships. Didn't turn the tide of the war, but it got the British attention. Played havoc with British freight rates, and it caused the British to bring some warships home from the Americans that had ships to protect their shipping interests at home. That ship sailed back into Baltimore. She was named Chasseur. hero's welcome when she came back to Baltimore and became known as Pride of Baltimore. That's the name you know her by today. Oh, and incidentally, they do have in Baltimore a copy of that proclamation that was nailed onto the door of Lloyd's in London. Now, the Baltimore Clipper is not the end product of this design evolution. Just, one step along the road, okay? And by the time C.W. Lawrence was sailing in 1850, they were already getting complaints that, hey, the new designs, the commercial ships that are coming out today are faster than C.W. Lawrence. So they were being out-designed by 1850. Because design evolution just keeps getting better, it just keeps evolving. One particular path that went on, the pilot schooners that were operating on the East Coast. The way pilot schooners worked is you've got to get your pilot out to meet the incoming vessel. The first guy there gets the job. So the pilot schooners would literally race each other out to meet an incoming ship so that they would get the job. So speed was kind of critical. They also had to be able to stay on station. Sometimes you might have to wait a while for incoming ships to come in. So they had to be reasonably seaworthy and capable of handling seas. But their cargo requirements were almost nil. They had to have enough for their crew for, a week or so. So these pilot schooners, they kind of became like extreme versions of Baltimore Clippers. They were lighter, narrower, finer entries, faster, truly super ships. One of them, a yacht with the name of America, sailed over to England, took on the entire Royal Yacht Squadron in 1851, in racing around the Isle of Wight, bested the entire yacht squadron, won a 100 guinea cup, which later became known as America's Cup. If we look at the lines of the pilot schooner America, you look at it and go, that's a Baltimore Clipper. A little narrower, a little finer, but it's got all the characteristics of a Baltimore Clipper. The evolution continued. They started going to what had become the extreme clippers of the mid to late 19th century. Some of these were much larger, some of them got up over 200 feet. Some of them were square rigged for very long voyages in the trades. They reached what I think was the pinnacle of commercial sailing ship design. There was a group in New York that were sailing passengers from New York around San Francisco. And it was a very big advertising point if you could advertise how fast you got your passengers to San Francisco. These guys would race each other around Cape Horn up to San Francisco in these clipper ships. The English designers, they're no fools. They saw there was something good going on, and they started going along the same path. Okay? And what are sometimes called the China tea clippers, they were racing tea from China back to London because there was a premium on the first load of tea that would come into London each year, could demand a very high price. So they literally had major races. It was followed in the press, and everybody would bet upon which ship was actually going to get in with this year's supply of tea. These ships, some of them set speed records that lasted over 100 years. Flying Cloud sailed New York to San Francisco in 89 days. And that was in 1854. That record was bested in 1990s by a purpose-built racing yacht. So it has been beaten, but it took 140 some years. Champion of the Seas recorded a record of 465 nautical miles in a day. That record lasted 110 years. This is a painting of Flying Cloud, and you can see these guys they were in a racing mindset. Let's hang out to sail and get there as fast as we can because we want to advertise that we set the record from New York to San Francisco. Unfortunately, most of the American extreme clippers were rather lightly built. They were wooden, they didn't last. I hit some button in, there we go. But we've got one in England, the Cuddy Sark. She's what we call composite. She was like metal frames and wooden planking. And she was severely burned in a fire, But they put in the efforts to rebuild her, and she's in a wonderful museum in London, and if you get there, do not miss it. It's fabulous. The picture on the left is an interior picture of a frame, and you see that distinctive V shape. The picture on the right, we're looking at her bow, and you can see how sharp that thing is. Some of these things have bows where the waterlines were actually concave. Cuddy Sark set the record in London, Melbourne in 61 days. So these are some really, really amazing sailing ships. Getting back to California, she's been outdesigned. Today's modern yachts, particularly in light air, can just sail circles around a 19th century schooner. But you give her the right conditions, you give her the right day, she'll be doing a respectable job, sometimes even more than that. This was a picture taken in 2019 when we sailed in the Schooner Cup Regatta, and we had good conditions and we won that day.
Also the right crew.
Right, I had a good crew on board that day. But if you get the chance to sail on California on a day where the wind is up to 15 knots or more, you're going to fall in love just like I did. Thank you. Have we got time for questions, or we start the walk off? Yeah.
Has the LA Olympic Organizing Committee reached out to the Maritime Museum to use California for the parade of tall ships again?
I have heard nothing of that, but that would be a wonderful idea. When are the Olympics? They're 28. That's a wonderful idea. I like. James, you going to sail it?
I'll take her.
I thought so.
Volunteer for crew.
Yeah.
So, just a general question, I wonder, everyone knows the horrors of Cape Cod. I wonder why more ships didn't choose to take the Strait of Magellan.
Fog and rocks.
Okay.
I mean, Strait of Magellan had its own set of horrors. And it was kind of like, pick your poison. Yeah.
One of the questions that guests often ask is, what's the purpose of breaking the masts? What does that buy you?
Breaking the mast technically doesn't seem to buy you much of anything. It really looks cool, but I think it's kind of a stylistic thing. And I think once that style gets started, it continues. The one thing that you can do with breaking the mast is in tuning the rig. I mean, you can change the center of effort on the rig by breaking the mast. Okay? You could do the same thing by moving the mast step. But usually by the time you're doing that, you don't want to move the mast step.
Yeah.
So it became a style, it's a style that works, and it's just continued. But you'll notice it's not continued in today's modern sailing yachts. They're pretty vertical in their masts.
Do we know if they really changed the rig from the brig to a schooner in California somewhere after it got here?
No, Californian was always rigged as a topsail schooner.
I mean, C.W. Lawrence.
Oh, no. C.W. Lawrence died before she made the rig change. But she only lived for 2 or 3 years. But it turns out the ship that we know as the Joseph Lane, she was actually the Campbell. She was the lead ship in the class. And her name was changed when she was sent to either Washington or Oregon, because the governor of those territories was named Joseph Lane. So they renamed her for that. And she was always a topsail schooner, and C.W. Lawrence was always a brig. Yeah.
I'm just curious, we see the paint scheme of the Californian when.
Sorry, my ears are turned.
Oh, the paint scheme change, to decide to go with a more traditional, cutter look as opposed to what Californian was. What was the decision, when was the decision made on that? Why didn't you just keep her the same color as she was when she was the tall ship of, sailing around the Pacific?
Yeah, when the museum acquired the ship and did retrofit and started to change a lot of things, they were trying to bring her back to the way she would have looked in 1850. And that's when the color scheme was changed. That's when they decided to paint the figurehead pasty white, which I thought was a shame, but that's me. But anyway, they were trying to make her look more like the revenue cutter of 1850, and we have been told that if we can find any evidence that cutters of that era had realistic lifelike paint, we could maybe repaint the figurehead, but we haven't found it.
Sadly, I've found the contrary, that this is actually reasonably accurate, and unfortunately that sort of puts the kibosh on restoring her figurehead to the monochrome paint, or to the polychrome paint.
That exact same issue came up when Star of India's figurehead was being refurbished by George Sutherland and his team. Should it be the polychrome coloring that I believe Captain Tim Renard had for the restoration, or should it be white? And Kevin Sheehan looked into the history of this and found that in Star's era, or Euterpe's era, it would have been plain white, and that the earliest photograph that anybody found in the 19th century of Euterpe definitely shows her with a white painted figurehead. And you can imagine a captain in a merchant ship on a very, very tight budget not wanting to deal with the frippery of fancy paint schemes and just saying, I got some white paint, there you go.
But if you do get to London and you go to the Cuddy Sark Museum, one thing they've got there is an exhibit of figureheads.
Yes.
Quite a few. And many of them are, how should I put it, outlandishly colored. They're wonderful. So I was kind of hoping we could go in that direction, but I got outmoved by historical accuracy. Okay?
Thank you very much.
One more comment, and we're going to do a walkabout in California. Can I get everybody to meet at the bottom of this ladder here? Because one of the first things I want to show you is one of Californian sales at Salvador, Berkeley. It gives you a perspective of what it's really like. Okay?
As always, Bob, you have something?
Real quick one.
A quick hint for the trainees more than anything. Page 247 of our manual has the silhouettes of the various types of rig. We're talking about what a rig was and all that. So therefore, it'd be a good idea to take a look at that, because
A real good idea.
a real good idea. Yeah. Oh, sorry. Oh, and I need. Happy with that, Jane?
Did you say there might be questions on this? There might be.
I didn't say that.
There might be. Great, thank you very much, Carl and Margaret. Those are great presentations. We're going to